Back in the mid-'80s, when I was driving a taxi in New York City, I was in a position to see a lot of weather of all sorts. A lot of weather, a lot of people. One day up on the Upper West Side, it was dusk, and just at the beginning of my shift, a man flagged me down from his apartment building on Columbus Avenue. Even before he looked around to see if there were any taxis anywhere near, he had this automatic reflex of the hand going up in the air so that he could walk the fewest steps possible. He climbed in back and snapped 85 Broad Street, which was down in the Wall Street area. No, please, no thanks. Hey, Chief, he says, can't you go a little faster? Can't you make this light up here? It's about to turn. Come on, I gotta make this light. I gotta get down to the office. Got important deals to make. Actually, I'd been doing pretty well with the lights before he'd barked at me. I had developed a way of watching several blocks ahead as I drove and anticipating the way the lights were tumbling and the traffic was clotting up or uncoagulating. I could aim for a spot that seemed especially crowded, but just when I arrived there, just when I caught up with that herd, they would part. Something had happened just ahead of them that I sensed caused them to open up a pathway for me. It astounded me when this happened, but it didn't astound this guy in back. He hadn't noticed. When we stopped for a red light, I pointed out a woman walking along the sidewalk in skimpy shoes, a coat that offered almost no protection. She looked very cold. I said, "That woman looks cold." And he said, "Well, Chief, it's a cold day out there. Of course she's cold." And I said, "Well, I don't think there's an of course about it. She could have dressed for the weather and then she wouldn't be cold." He hadn't dressed for the weather either. He had his suit on. That was it. He said, "What, you know about dressing for the weather? You're an expert on that?" I said, "Well, I've lived other places where it really did get cold, where we had to dress up." "Where are you from anyway?" he says. "You talk kind of funny. I don't know. Where'd you get this accent you're using?" "In Minnesota." "Oh, Minnesota," the guy says. "Minnesota. Well, that explains it." "Yeah, what's it explain?" "Well, the way you talk so funny, like those Canadians along the border. You lived right up there by the Canadian border. I know where Minnesota is." I lived in Minneapolis. It's a few hours from Canada, but I can see how that would seem close from this distance. By now we're moving again. We're rolling down Columbus, rocking sideways. I'm trying to avoid the worst potholes, even though I wouldn't mind hitting one really bad one for him, but I'm going to get him to his job as fast as I can. He'll pay me and go away. That was one beauty of cab driving. Even when you got super obnoxious people, you could comfort yourself by thinking as you're driving, well, the longest this ride together will last will be 8 or 9 minutes. And then he'll be gone and I'll be on to the next. So he says, "Tell me about how smart you were dressing for the weather in Minnesota." I said, "Well, I worked outdoor. I worked on the railroad." "You're an engineer on a passenger train? You like having passengers." I said, "Well, no, I wasn't an engineer. I was a brakeman." "You know what a brakeman is?" He said, "Nah." He didn't care what a brakeman was. This kind of weather we're having here now in New York, balmy day for Minnesota, it wouldn't have required much special dressing, but once it got below zero, we'd start dressing up in layers. First your underwear, and then long underwear, a couple of pairs of socks, one of those waffle weave sweatshirts, maybe a sweater on top of that if it's starting to get really cold, if it's going 10 below. working outdoors, I wore an Air Force parka that had a hood that tightened around my face, and I wore railroad mitts, which were leather mittens that are loose in case when you're making a joint between two cars, coupling two cars, you happen to get your fingertips caught in the coupler. These were baggy enough, loose enough that you could pull your hands free. So the only part of me that wasn't really bundled up, because I had on big heavy boots, Sorel boots with felt liners, was this little round patch of my face. So it got cold, did it? Your face. Yeah, it got cold in a way that might have made New Yorkers cry to just think about. If the wind was really blowing, like it was one time, this time I'm thinking of, in a town way off in the western prairie, west of Minneapolis, out near the Dakota border, the wind was really blowing and the temperature was 30 below. As cold as it was, there was some snow coming down. I just joined two boxcars together. I was out on the ground and I would give hand signs to the engineer and I would tell him to stop, and the couplers would just jostle in together at the right speed, and the pin would drop down and lock the knuckle, as we said, of the coupler together. And it made a good joint there, and I'd say, tug ahead on them, Joe, make sure they're all together. And Joe, the engineer, would take a tug on them and then stop. Then I'd say, okay, hold it right there, don't move, I got to get in and couple up the air. So I go between these two boxcars and take these big air hoses that were about the thickness of a guy's arm, and they were all rigid from the cold. They were made of rubber, but super rigid. You had to kind of break them with both arms to get them flexible, and then pull them up and lock them down into place, and then the air brake system would shoot air through the length of the train eventually. Then I got the air hung and I was turning to go on to the next car on the next track over that we were going to have to couple onto, when all of a sudden I went blind. You didn't, says my passenger. My eyes froze shut. That's how cold it can get in Minnesota. We don't bellyache about the cold weather so much there. He thought about this. He didn't call me chief. He didn't call me boss. He said, I don't believe you. Your eyes didn't freeze shut. Well, I couldn't see. And I was there and my eyes were shut and I couldn't open them. I should have had goggles on or something like you wear when you're skiing. I had a walkie-talkie and I called out to the engineer and I said, Joe, can you see me from where you are? And he said, yeah, I can just make you out. I can see you. You're about a couple 100 feet away. And through the snow, I can still make you out. You can't see anything? I said, no, you're going to have to guide me back to the engine. I thought of trying to force my eyes open, but then it dawned on me that this skin on your eyes is kind of delicate and I could have ripped it. So I said, you'll have to walk me back. And he said, all right. No, a little to your left now. Okay, keep coming that way. A little more to your left. That's good. Keep coming, slow now. There's a rail coming up. You want to step over in about 5 feet. Take it easy. Okay, good. You got over that. And in such a manner, he guided me back to the engine, and I could feel my way on up the ladder. I let myself into the cab of the engine, sat there, and my eyes finally thawed out, my eyelids, and I could see again. At which point Joe called up our conductor in the caboose nearly a mile away, because we had 90 cars on the main line and we were picking up all these cars on these little side tracks. Charlie, he said, I think our working day is over. And Charlie, who was the titular head of the crew because he was the conductor, he's just an older a brakeman with more seniority, really. Charlie called back on the radio and said, "Yeah, I heard what's going on. You better pull us up to the crossing and we'll get off and then we can put these cars away and go home. This is ridiculous." And so that was the way it happened, I told this guy. And by now I'd practically got him down to Broad Street and I'd gotten him quieted down. He'd been bouncing around in the back seat at first because he had this go need to be moving faster down the street, and the best he could do to activate that was to peer down through the windshield and try to help me to drive better by pointing out what lights were about to turn red and what weren't. But he had settled down in the course of my going on about the time my eyes froze shut. He paid me his fare. He even gave me a tip, which surprised me a little bit. Super aggressive guys who made super amounts of money often didn't give super big tips. But this guy was in a generous mood. He was going to make a big deal, he said. So he paid me and tipped me and he went away. And my eyes were still open.